The static hissed from the Bakelite headphones, a relentless, sibilant sound like a nest of cornered snakes in the dry grass of the steppe. Major Dmitri Volkov pressed them tighter against his ears, the cracked leather pads doing little to warm his skin, the unforgiving plastic doing nothing to block out the tremor that had taken root deep within his own hands. He willed them to be still, the hands of a professional, a decorated officer of the first chief directorate of the KGB, a man who could field strip a Makarov PM in the pitch dark and hold a Zenit E camera steady during a high-speed chase through the back alleys of Vienna. But they betrayed him. A fine, almost invisible vibration that traveled up the worn, threadbare sleeves of his uniform jacket and settled like a block of glacial ice in the hollow of his chest. The air in the attic listening post was a suffocating, stratified cocktail of smells, each layer telling its own story of misery and vigilance. At the floor level, the damp, penetrating chill of the Moscow winter seeped through the warped floorboards, carrying a faint, defeated scent of wet wool, diesel fumes from the street below, and the underlying must of century-old dust. Higher up, the air was thick with the ghost of Lieutenant Sasha Orlov's cheap, pungent Prima cigarettes, a smell like burning rope and bitter disappointment that clung to the splintered rafters and the dangling cobwebs. And woven through it all was the sharp, electric tang of ozone, a constant metallic exhalation from the humming racks of signal processors and the slowly turning reels of the Jupiter 203 tape machines that filled their cramped, claustrophobic space. It was an air that had been breathed too many times, filled with too much anxiety, too little sleep, and the unspoken fear of catastrophic failure. Below them, across the slush-choked, miserably gray lane of Kutuzovsky Prospect, sat the target, a second-floor apartment in the heavily monitored American diplomatic compound, a fortress of capitalist indulgence masquerading as a home. Inside that apartment, amidst the chintz sofas, the heavy mahogany furniture, and the cloying, alien smell of freshly percolated Maxwell House coffee, was Asset Kestrel. Kestrel was not a man or a woman. Kestrel was not even human. Kestrel was a parrot, an African gray of the subspecies Psittacus erythicus erythicus. And at that precise moment, it was chirping a frantic, horribly off-key and accelerated rendition of Yankee Doodle. The tinny, panicked notes sliced through the gray ocean of static on the R399A Catron receiver. A sound as alarming to Volkov as a klaxon screaming in the dead of night inside a nuclear silo. It was the sound of everything coming apart. What in God's name is that? Lieutenant Sasha Orlov, his young, perpetually nervous technician, whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, cracking on the last word. The emerald-green glow from the oscilloscope's sweeping line painted his gaunt face in sickly hues, highlighting the beads of sweat on his upper lip and the dark, sleepless circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. At 23, Sasha was a prodigy with radio frequencies, a virtuoso who could pinpoint a rogue transmission to within a city block using nothing but a directional antenna and a slide rule. But he was a novice in the face of genuine, unfolding crisis. "It's the distress signal," Volkov said, his own voice a low growl, swallowed by the humming machinery. He didn't need the decryption matrix or the signal analysis software humming at his elbow. He had spent 18 agonizing months personally conditioning the bird. He had designed the signals himself, a secret language of squawks, whistles, and mimicry. A specific, agitated squawk meant the leg band was loose. An off-key, three-note whistle meant low power on the internal capacitor. But Yankee Doodle, jumbled, manic, and repeated without pause, was the apocalypse code. It meant the asset perceived an immediate, existential threat to the mission. imminent discovery. A threat? Sir, from what? The diplomat's wife finally got tired of it and threatened to make soup. Sasha attempted a joke, his long, nimble fingers twitching on the console. But the tremor in his own voice betrayed him. The fear was plain in his wide, green-lit eyes. Vance doesn't have a cat, and his wife adores the bird, Volkov snapped. His gaze locked on the sensitive Yagi-Uda directional antenna, a delicate spiderweb of aluminum aimed with millimeter precision at the diplomat's window. Patch the ambient audio through the main speaker. Run it through the AN4 filter. I want voice, and I want it clean. Now. Sasha's fingers flew across a panel of switches and dials with a series of practiced, metallic clicks. The corrosive hiss of static receded, replaced by the warm, domestic sounds of the apartment. The delicate clink of a porcelain coffee cup on a saucer. The rustle of a newspaper, likely the International Herald Tribune, its pages turning with a crisp, expensive sound. And then, a woman's voice, clear and laced with fretful concern. Eleanor Vance, the diplomat's lonely, isolated wife. A woman whose psychological profile Volkov knew better than his own. I just don't know what's wrong with him, Arthur. He's been plucking his feathers all morning, just pulling them right out. There are little gray ones all over the Aubusson carpet. Then the deeper, resonant baritone of Arthur Vance, the primary target. Vance was the deputy chief of mission, the CIA's unofficial station chief, and the man whose secrets could tip the delicate, terrifying balance of the Cold War. He's a bird, Ellie. They're neurotic creatures. Maybe he's bored. The snows kept you from taking him to the park. Buy him another mirror. He'll fall in love with his own reflection and forget all about it. He's never done this before. She insisted, her voice rising slightly, tight with genuine maternal worry. And his leg. Look at his leg band. It looks irritated. The skin is all red and puffy around it. I'm calling Dr. Finley at the embassy clinic. He's a veterinarian. He used to treat the ambassador's beagle. He can take a look this afternoon. Volkov felt a dread so profound it was physical. A column of ice forming in his spine, colder than the brutal Moscow wind, rattling the attic's poorly sealed window frames. The leg band. The innocuous-looking silver band, so carefully designed to resemble a standard ornithological marker from the Audubon Society, was a marvel of the KGB's Directorate T, the scientific and technical division. It housed a kinetic charger powered by piezoelectric crystals, a keyword-activated solid-state recorder etched onto a flexible polymer substrate, and a microwave burst transmitter. It was also, apparently, beginning to fail. Its rhodium-plated steel coating was likely degrading under the constant friction and exposure to the bird's body chemistry, leaching trace amounts of nickel and causing a severe allergic reaction. An embassy veterinarian, even a clumsy, half-drunk one specializing in beagles, would not miss it. He would remove the band to treat the inflamed skin. He would feel its unusual weight, notice its seamless unibody construction. He would find the micro-servos for the release mechanism, and he would certainly find the data port, disguised as a decorative etching of the Kremlin that the engineers at Novosibirsk had insisted on as a point of institutional pride. The mission, codenamed Project Nightingale, would be blown wide open. 18 months of painstaking work, of unprecedented resources, would evaporate in an instant. And with it, Volkov's career, or more likely, his life. In the gray, unforgiving corridors of the Lubyanka, failure of this magnitude was not forgiven. It was erased. She's going for the phone, Sasha breathed, his face ashen. He pointed a trembling finger at the oscilloscope. where the faint electronic signature of a rotary dial being used spiked the smooth green line into a frantic sawtooth pattern. "Sir, what are our orders? What do we do?" Volkov didn't answer. He was listening past the voices, past the Parrot's frantic song. He was listening to the machine. He tweaked the gain on his own headset with the delicate, practiced touch of a safecracker, isolating a specific frequency range. There it was. A high-frequency carrier wave, faint but steady, broadcasting on the 433.92 MHz band. It wasn't their scheduled burst. It was a continuous, low-power signal. A malfunction. The piezoelectric charger was failing, causing a power surge that had fried the transmission gate, locking it in the on position. It was a beacon, a homing signal, a death sentence for the entire operation. "Get me General Rykov on the secure line," Volkov commanded, ripping the headphones from his head with such force they clattered against the console. "Use the K8 scrambler, now." The game was over. The only question left was how to sweep the pieces from the board before the Americans even realized they had been checkmated. The entire insane enterprise had been born of desperation and a great deal of five-star Armenian brandy in a sweltering dacha a year and a half earlier. General Ivan Rykov, a man whose face seemed permanently carved from unforgiving granite, swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the condensation tracing lines through the acrid cigar smoke clinging to the humid August air. "They sweep the residence twice a day," he grumbled, his voice a gravelly testament to a lifetime of paparosi cigarettes and shouted orders. The CIA station chief in Moscow, a man named Henderson before Vance, he was good, too good. Vance is better. Their technical services team is a pack of wizards from Langley. We plant our microphones in the lamps, in the walls, in the goddamned sugar bowl. They find them in 12 hours, leave them on the ambassador's desk with a little note. It's humiliating. We need something they won't look for. Something organic. Volkov, then just a senior lieutenant in the 1st Chief Directorate, had remained silent, letting the older men vent their frustrations. He was an analyst, a strategist, not a field man. He was known for his unorthodox thinking, which was both the reason for his painfully slow promotion and the sole reason he'd been invited to this informal, high-level brainstorming session at Rykov's personal dacha. "A rat," suggested Colonel Belov, a man whose imagination was as blunt and functional as his square, pockmarked features. "We could train a rat to carry a bug into the wainscoting. Their nests are everywhere in these old buildings. And the diplomat's wife screams and beats it to death with a broomstick," Rykov countered, downing his brandy in one fiery gulp that didn't even make him blink. "Taking our multi-million ruble device with it. No. We need something that belongs there. Something they invite inside. Something they love." That was when the idea, small, absurd, and utterly brilliant, had taken root in Volkov's mind. He remembered a documentary he'd seen late one night on a captured Western television, a pirated BBC film about the uncanny mimicry of birds. "What about a pet?" he said quietly, the words barely audible over the insistent buzzing of a fat blue bottle fly against the window pane. The two older men turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if a child had interrupted a serious conversation. "Eleanor Vance," Volkov continued, gaining confidence as the logic assembled itself with crystalline clarity in his mind. "Our psychological profile, File 7-4 Alpha, indicates she is profoundly lonely, childless. Her husband is married to his work, absent even when he is home. She grew up on a farm in Virginia with animals. She has tried to get a dog twice, but the diplomatic quarantine protocols are too lengthy and difficult. Our surveillance shows she frequents the Arbat market, looking at the pet stalls. She buys breadcrumbs for the pigeons. Rykov leaned forward, his small, piggish eyes narrowing into predatory slits. A cat? A dog? The Americans X-ray every animal that enters their compound. They're paranoid about exactly this sort of thing. Not a mammal, Volkov said, letting the word hang in the smoky, oppressive air. A bird, a talking bird. No one would think to X-ray a parrot for skeletal anomalies. And what is a parrot, General? It is a biological recording device. It listens, it mimics. It is the one thing in the world that is expected to repeat what it hears. For a moment, there was a profound silence, broken only by the fly. Colonel Belov opened his mouth to object, but Rykov held up a massive, scarred hand. Then the general began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a deep, rumbling, seismic event that shook his large frame and made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate. He laughed until tears streamed from his eyes, and he had to pound his fist on the heavy oak table to catch his breath. When he finally stopped, he slammed his empty glass down. "Volkov," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of a hand as thick as a brick. "You are either a genius or you are completely insane. I don't have time to decide which. Write me a proposal. Detail every step, every contingency. If this fails, you will be counting polar bears in Siberia for the rest of your short, miserable life. But if it works..." He left the promise hanging in the air, more potent and intoxicating than any explicit reward. Project Nightingale was born from that haze of smoke and madness. The search began not for a spy, but for a species. Ornithologists from Moscow State University were quietly conscripted, told they were working on a state-sponsored conservation project. They settled on the African gray. Highly intelligent, capable of vocabularies of hundreds of words, and with a lifespan that could exceed 50 years, it was the perfect long-term candidate. A clutch of 10 young birds was procured through a complex cutout operation involving a disgruntled zookeeper in Brussels, a corrupt customs official in Helsinki, and a West German arms dealer who owed the KGB a significant favor involving a misplaced shipment of anti-tank missiles. The 10 birds were brought to a secret facility, a purpose-built aviary at a secure KGB dacha, designated Object 17. It was here that Volkov met his charge. He was not an ornithologist. He was a spy. But he learned. He devoured every book, every scientific monograph on avian psychology and behavioral conditioning. He learned that fear was a poor teacher for such an intelligent creature. Trust, routine, and a steady supply of sunflower seeds was the key. He and a small, hand-picked team of specialists began the selection process. They tested for memory, mimicry, temperament, and resilience to stress. One bird was too aggressive, another too timid. But the third, designated Subject Gamma, was different. It was curious, bold. It watched Volkov not as a source of food, but with an unnerving, analytical intelligence in its dark, glossy eyes. This was the one. They named him Gosha. The technological challenge was immense. A live transmitter was out of the question. Its constant signal would be detected instantly. The solution, devised by a pale, chain-smoking prodigy from the Novosibirsk Akademgorodok Science City, was the leg band. It wasn't just a container. It was the device. A flexible, layered circuit board was printed onto a polymer substrate, then coated in a thin layer of rhodium-plated steel. Inside this microscopic architecture was the power system. Batteries were impossible. The solution was piezoelectric. A series of microcrystals of lead zirconate titanate were layered within the band. The bird's every movement, hopping, climbing, shaking its leg, caused these crystals to deform under mechanical stress, generating a tiny electrical charge. This trickle of power was stored in a solid-state capacitor, a sliver of graphene that could hold a charge for weeks. But this power was insufficient for constant recording. The device needed to be smart. It operated in a state of near dormancy, drawing mere microwatts of power, enough to keep a single component active. The Lomo 7 voice print recognition chip. The KGB had hundreds of hours of recordings of Arthur Vance's voice. Gosha's device was programmed to listen for that specific vocal frequency and timbre. When Vance's voice was detected, a second-stage processor would activate, this one listening for keywords. The list was extensive. Warsaw Pact, Pershing, Geneva, Backchannel, Defector, Kremlin, and dozens more. Only when the device heard both Vance's voice and a keyword would the main recording system activate. It would capture 5 minutes of audio onto a solid-state memory chip, compressing it into a file less than a megabyte in size. The chip could hold approximately 2 hours of total audio. Getting the data off was the final puzzle. The answer was a microwave audio data burst, or MADB. The attic listening post was equipped with a highly directional microwave emitter. Once a day, at 0300, when the RF spectrum over Moscow was quietest, Sasha would send a coded, millisecond-long pulse on the 2.45 gigahertz frequency. If Gosha was within 10 meters of the window, the leg band would receive the ping and immediately broadcast its entire stored data package in a compressed burst lasting less than half a second. It was a digital needle in a haystack of signals. The training was a grueling 18-month marathon of patience and precision. Volkov became Gosha's entire world. He fed him, cleaned his cage, spoke to him for hours, first in Russian, then gradually in English. He used a system of positive reinforcement. When Gosha mimicked a desired English phrase, "Pretty bird, good morning," he was rewarded with a sunflower seed or a piece of mango. But the real work was more subtle, more insidious. Volkov conditioned the bird to associate Arthur Vance's voice with pleasure. He would play recordings of Vance's speeches, and as the diplomat's rich baritone filled the lab, Volkov would give Gosha his favorite treats. The goal was for the bird to actively seek out the source of that voice. Then came the silent training. Gosha was a mimic, but he could not be allowed to repeat the keywords. That would be an instant giveaway. Using a combination of negative reinforcement, a sharp, unpleasant noise from an ultrasonic emitter, they trained the bird to hear words like missile or Kremlin and remain silent. It was a perverse form of conditioning, teaching a talking bird what not to say. The bird was being sculpted into the perfect spy, one who listens, records, and never, ever talks. The insertion was a masterpiece of clandestine tradecraft. Eleanor Vance was a known patron of a small, dusty antique shop near the Christ the Savior Cathedral. The shop owner, a portly, sweating man named Sergei, had been a KGB informant for 20 years. A German businessman, an agent from the Czech STB, sold Sergei a magnificent antique gilded birdcage. A week later, Volkov's team staged a scene. An agent posing as a distraught pet owner claimed his prized African gray had escaped and flown into the shop. He was in a rush, he lamented, and in a fit of manufactured generosity, he gave the bird to Sergei. 2 days later, Eleanor Vance entered the shop. As planned, Sergei showed her the cage, and as if on cue, Gosha, now codenamed Kestrel and answering to Polly, whistled the first few bars of Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade, a tune she was known to hum. She was enchanted. Sergei sold her the cage and included the found bird for a pittance. Asset Kestrel was in. For 3 months, the operation was flawless. The nightly data bursts delivered a stream of priceless intelligence. They learned the name of a potential KGB defector. They captured pillow talk in which Vance complained about the Secretary of State's drinking problem. It was a fire hose of information. Volkov and his team were heroes. General Rykov had personally promised him a promotion to colonel and the Order of the Red Banner. But now, it was all unraveling in a storm of static and the panicked squawks of a terrified bird. "The general is on," Sasha said, handing Volkov a handset that smelled of hot plastic and ozone. "Report." Rykov's voice crackled, devoid of any preamble, sharp as a shard of ice. "Sir, the asset is compromised. The diplomat's wife suspects the leg band is causing an irritation. She is attempting to contact an embassy veterinarian. The asset is broadcasting the level 1 distress signal. I also have a continuous, low-power carrier wave from the device itself on 433.92 megahertz. It's a hardware malfunction, a critical failure in the transmission gate." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Volkov could picture Rykov in his soundproof office at the Lubyanka, the smoke from his cigar curling around his head like a shroud, his face an unreadable mask of granite. "What is the status of the data?" "The last successful burst was at 0300 this morning. The device should contain approximately 12 hours of new recordings. 12 hours that may contain Vance's final instructions before he flies to Geneva tomorrow morning." Rykov mused aloud. The words a low rumble. The stakes were impossibly high. The device cannot be allowed to fall into their hands. It would expose capabilities they do not know we possess. It would compromise Directorate T for a decade. The Americans would learn more from that single piece of hardware than from a dozen defectors. "Agreed, sir," Volkov said, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "The bird is a secondary consideration," Rykov stated, his voice flat and hard as steel. "The priority is the technology. You have a 2-hour window before this vet, Finley, can get there. The Vances are scheduled to attend a reception at the French embassy at 1900 hours. They will be gone for at least 3 hours. You will infiltrate the residence and retrieve the device. If you can retrieve the bird, do so. If not, dispose of it. Make it look like it flew out an open window. Under no circumstances can that band be examined by the Americans. Sir, infiltration of a diplomatic residence. The risk of a diplomatic incident is enormous. The risk of them getting their hands on Directorate T's latest micro-recorder is greater." Rykov cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have your orders, Major. You will lead the entry team. You trained the asset. You will be the one to recover it. Do not fail." The line went dead with a final, definitive click. Volkov stood in the cold attic, the general's words echoing in his mind. Dispose of it. He looked across the street at the warmly lit window. He had spent more time with that bird than he had with his own wife in the last year and a half. He knew its favorite foods, the way it clicked its beak when it was content, the soft flutter of its wings as it settled for the night. He had created a spy, but in the process, he had forged a bond of strange, unspoken companionship. And now, he was being ordered to kill his own agent. The plan was crude, born of necessity and a ticking clock. At 19:05 hours, a black Volga sedan, its engine expertly sabotaged to produce clouds of white smoke and an alarming banging sound, stalled at the main entrance to the American compound, blocking the Vance's armored Chrysler from leaving. As embassy security guards swarmed the apparent breakdown, shouting in a mixture of English and panicked Russian, creating a perfect diversion. A two-man team dressed as city utility workers scaled the rear wall of the compound, shielded from view by a row of dense fir trees dripping with wet snow. Volkov was one of them. The other was a compact, silent man from Department 8, the Executive Action Unit, known only as Misha. Misha's specialty was silent entry, and when necessary, silent exits for problems both mechanical and human. They moved through the shadows of the courtyard, the wet snow crunching under their boots with a sound that seemed deafening to Volkov. His breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of white anxiety. He carried a small leather satchel containing a set of titanium lockpicks, a frequency scanner, and a small cage lined with sound-dampening acoustic foam. Misha carried only a suppressed Makarov PB pistol, and coiled in his pocket like a sleeping viper, a garrote wire. They reached the service entrance to the Vance's apartment building. The lock was a standard American-made Schlage, but Volkov knew the CIA would have added traps. He pulled out a small fiber-optic scope, inserting it into the keyway. He saw no tripwires, no pressure plates. Misha stood guard, a motionless shadow against the brick wall, his head turning in slow, methodical sweeps. Volkov went to work. His fingers, though numb with cold, were steady now, the tremor burned away by adrenaline. He had practiced on this exact model of lock 1,000 times. The tumblers clicked, one by one, soft as a lover's whisper. The lock sprang open. Inside, the hallway was quiet and smelled of floor wax and boiled cabbage. They took the stairs to the second floor. The frequency scanner in Volkov's hand pulsed faintly, confirming the malfunctioning beacon. They reached the apartment door. This was the real challenge. An embassy-grade high-security Medeco lock with a steel-reinforced frame. Volkov knelt, his ear pressed to the cold wood. He heard nothing. He began the delicate process with a titanium tension wrench and a thin hook pick. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sweat on his brow froze in the cold. Finally, a satisfying thud as the bolt retracted. He pushed the door open a crack. The apartment was dark, save for a single lamp casting a warm, golden pool of light in the living room. And there, in the center of the room, was the gilded cage. Inside, Polly sat on his perch, his head cocked. As Volkov stepped into the room, the bird let out a soft squawk. It wasn't the distress signal. It was a sound of recognition. "Easy, Gosha," Volkov whispered in Russian. He moved slowly toward the cage. Misha slipped past him, a wraith in the darkness, clearing the other rooms with the silent, practiced efficiency of a predator. Volkov reached the cage. The bird shuffled on its perch, looking at him with its intelligent, knowing eyes. He could see the inflamed red skin around the leg band. He unlatched the cage door, his hand moving slowly. "Come on, boy," he cooed softly. "Time to go home." He extended his arm. After a moment's hesitation, the parrot hopped onto his wrist, a familiar, comforting weight. Volkov felt a surge of profound relief. Misha appeared at his side like a ghost. "Clear," he grunted. Volkov's task now was to remove the band. It was designed with a magnetic release clasp, impossible to open without a small, powerful neodymium magnet disguised as a fountain pen. He reached into his satchel, but as his fingers brushed against the cool metal, a sound froze him in place. A key, scraping and turning in the lock of the front door. They hadn't gone to the reception. It was a trap, or monumentally bad luck. It didn't matter which. "Back!" Misha hissed, melting back toward the kitchen without a sound. Volkov reacted on pure animal instinct. There was no time to escape. He lunged for the nearest hiding spot, a heavy velvet curtain next to a large window overlooking the courtyard. He pulled the thick, dust-smelling fabric around himself, the parrot still perched silently on his wrist, its claws digging into his skin like tiny needles. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The door opened. Arthur Vance walked in, followed by his wife. "I told you I forgot the briefing papers," he was saying, his voice tight with irritation. "I can't go to Geneva without them." "It's always something, isn't it?" Eleanor replied, her voice weary and resigned. "You're lucky the car broke down right at the gate. We'd have been halfway across town." Vance switched on the main lights. The room flooded with brilliance. Volkov squeezed his eyes shut behind the curtain, praying the heavy fabric would hide his silhouette. He could feel the parrot tremble on his arm. One squawk, one sound, and they were dead men. "I'll just be a minute," Vance said, walking toward the study. Eleanor sighed and walked over to the birdcage. "Oh, Polly," she said softly. Her voice was just inches from Volkov's hiding place. "You're quiet tonight. Are you feeling better?" Volkov felt the bird shift on his wrist. 18 months of training, Gosha. Remember the silent training. Be silent." Eleanor reached into the cage. Her hand searched the perch, then the floor of the cage. "Polly?" she said, a note of sharp confusion in her voice. "Where are you?" She looked around the cage, her eyes wide, and then she began to scan the room. Her gaze swept past the curtain, then snapped back with unnerving speed. Time seemed to slow down. Volkov saw her eyes widen. She wasn't looking at the curtain itself, but at the polished floor beneath it. He risked a glance down. 2 small gray feathers lay on the floorboards, starkly illuminated by the lamplight. She knew. She didn't know what she knew, but she knew something was wrong. Her mouth opened, a perfect O of terror, as she drew in a breath to scream. In that split second, Volkov knew the mission had utterly failed. Before Eleanor could make a sound, the parrot on his arm did something utterly unexpected. It spoke. Not in English, not a squawk, not a distress signal. In a perfect crystalline imitation of Eleanor's own gentle tone, it said, "Pretty bird?" Eleanor froze, the scream dying in her throat. Her eyes darted from the curtain to the top of a tall bookshelf near the ceiling. "Polly? Are you up there, you naughty boy? You scared me." Arthur Vance came out of the study, holding a leather briefcase. "What is it, Ellie?" "The bird's out of his cage again," she said, her voice shaky but miraculously controlled. "He's up on the bookshelf." "Leave him," Vance said impatiently. "We're already late. He'll come down when he's hungry. Let's go." She hesitated, glancing one last, long time at the curtain, a deep furrow of suspicion still etched on her brow. But she turned and followed her husband out of the apartment. The door closed. The lock turned. Volkov waited, not daring to breathe, for a full 5 minutes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart and the soft click of the parrot's beak against his thumb. He had been saved by a phrase he had taught the bird a lifetime ago. He slipped from behind the curtain. Misha emerged from the kitchen, his face in a motionless mask, but his eyes held a flicker of grudging respect. Without a word, Volkov used the magnetic pen. The leg band clicked open. He slid it off the bird's leg and slipped it into a lead-lined pouch. Then he placed the now unfettered parrot into the soundproofed cage. The exfiltration was clean. They were out of the compound and driving away in a different car before the Vance's replacement vehicle had even arrived. The debriefing was in Rykov's office, a room that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of work. The data from the leg band was already being analyzed. It was a gold mine. Vance's entire negotiating strategy for the Geneva summit was laid bare. including the absolute bottom-line concessions the Americans were willing to make. Project Nightingale was an unqualified, spectacular success. "A Major Volkov," Rykov said, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "You have done the state a great service. Your promotion to colonel is confirmed. The Order of the Red Banner will be awarded at the end of the month." "Thank you, Comrade General," Volkov said, standing stiffly at attention. "And the asset?" Rykov asked, lighting a fresh cigar, the smoke wreathing his head. "Misha's report says you retrieved it." "Yes, sir. It is back at Object 17. It is unharmed." Rykov took a long, satisfying puff from his cigar. "Good. Have it terminated. We can't risk it repeating anything inconvenient. Its purpose is served." Volkov felt the column of ice return to his spine. "Sir, the asset performed perfectly. It saved the operation. Its conditioning is flawless. It could be redeployed." "Redeployed where?" Rykov scoffed, waving his cigar dismissively. "We can't use the same trick twice. The Americans will be X-raying every pigeon that lands on their windowsill from now on. No, its life as a spy is over. It is a loose end. Terminate it." The general's voice was flat, final. It was an order. That night, Volkov drove his personal Zhiguli to Object 17. The guards at the gate, recognizing his car, let him through without a word. He walked into the familiar, climate-controlled aviary. The air was warm and humid, smelling of birdseed and disinfectant. Gosha was in his old training cage, looking healthier and more alert than he had in weeks without the irritating band on his leg. When the bird saw Volkov, it let out a series of happy clicks and whistles. It flew to the bars of the cage, pressing its head against them, waiting for the familiar scratch behind the ears that always followed a successful training exercise. Volkov looked at the bird, this small creature that held state secrets in its tiny brain. This living being he had twisted and shaped into a weapon. He had been ordered to dispose of it, to erase the evidence. He was a soldier of the Rodina, a Chekist. His duty was to obey. He reached inside his heavy wool coat, but his hand didn't go for the Makarov holstered at his hip. Instead, he pulled out a small, ripe mango he had bought from a special hard currency store that morning, an extravagance he could now afford. He opened the cage door. "Come on, Gosha," he whispered in Russian, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. The parrot hopped onto his arm without hesitation. He didn't take it to the small, soundproofed room at the back of the facility designated for disposal. He walked out of the aviary, past the confused guards to whom he merely nodded, and into the dense, snow-covered forest that surrounded the dacha. He walked for a long time, the crunch of his boots the only sound, until the lights of the compound were a distant, hazy memory. He stopped in a small clearing where the moonlight broke through the pine boughs, turning the undisturbed snow into a carpet of diamonds. An African gray parrot could not survive a Russian winter. This was still a death sentence, but it was a different kind of death. It was a death preceded by a moment of freedom. He held up his arm. "Fly, Gosha," he said, his voice raw. The bird looked at him, its head cocked as if confused. It had never known a world beyond a cage or a room. It did not understand. "Fly," Volkov repeated, his voice breaking. He gave his arm a gentle push upwards. The parrot spread its wings, a reflex born of instinct. With a powerful, surprising thrust, it launched into the freezing night air. It circled once, a dark silhouette against the stark white moon, a creature of the tropics impossibly displaced in the heart of the Russian winter. And then it flew off, disappearing into the blackness of the forest. Volkov stood alone in the profound silence, the cold seeping deep into his bones. The mission was a success. He was a hero of the Soviet Union. But as he stood there, he felt a profound and hollow emptiness that no medal or promotion could ever fill. He had won the battle. But in the silent flight of that bird, he felt the deep, gnawing certainty that he had lost something far more important. As he turned to walk back, a final, chilling thought pierced his mind, an echo from the day's chaos. The last data file recovered from the leg band, the one recorded just before the Vances came home, hadn't been of the Diplomat. The technicians had marked it as ambient noise, the Parrot talking to itself. But Volkov had insisted on listening to it himself before the debriefing. It was the sound of the Parrot, alone in its cage, practicing a new phrase, one it had never been taught, one it had overheard and somehow understood. In a perfect, clear imitation of Volkov's own voice from their months of quiet, late-night training sessions, it had been whispering a single Russian word over and over again. Svoboda, freedom,